Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Politics in America, politics in the Middle East. You use the name of a famous politician or a general, and you give it to a high school or a junior high school or a community center, and you embrace the concept of victory, of going forward. You honor the deceased, or you represent a tradition. It works the same the world over. So I go to Bill Roggio and Thomas Joscelyn of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and discover that in Iraq, the Shiite militia associated with what success the Iraqi central government has had these last months, combating Daesh, the Islamic State, the Shiite militia is following in this tradition. Bill, a very good evening to you. The Shiite militia, they have a training camp, so they are very much in the train of ISIS and al-Nusra training camps. You take young men who volunteer and you give them skills of small arms. Who have they named this training camp for, and what is the significance? Good evening to you, Bill.
Good evening, John. Yes, and the group is called Syria al-Khorassani. It's an Iranian-backed Shia militia. It's closely linked to Quds Force. It named this Quds Force, which is Iran's special operations branch that directs terrorism attacks and counterinsurgency and supports Shia militias in countries throughout the Middle East, including Hezbollah, and the Houthis in Yemen, and groups like that. It named this camp after a general. His name is Hamid Takavi. He was killed by an Islamic State sniper inside Iraq, and at the time that he was killed, he was serving as an advisor to Syria al-Khorassani. So this is, you have a Shia, Iranian-backed Shia militia openly stating, hey, that. And by the way, they were very clear about their support for Takavi and what they felt about him after he was killed. They put posters of him up in Baghdad, and they hailed him as a great leader and a genius in waging counterinsurgency, and for providing them in guerrilla operations, things of that nature. So, what you have is a Shia militia that is on the receiving end of support from the U.S., either intentional or non-intentional, when U.S. airstrikes are occurring in support of Iraqi government and militia operations, openly praising a Quds Force general who was killed while serving with them.
So we're seeing a merger of the Iranian warfighting with the nascent Iraqi warfighting. There are still photographs, I'm presuming this is from a video, Bill, showing a training camp. They're all very well dressed. Is this material from the U.S.? Did they buy this from the Brits? Where are they getting their uniforms and their weapons?
Well, it's funny. When you look at a lot of the weapons they're using U.S.-issued M16A1s, which are issued to the Iraqi military. Whether they procured them from the Iraqi military or whatnot, certainly is a great question, but they certainly have access to U.S. weaponry. I would guess that they're receiving a lot of material support from Quds Force. That's the MO for Quds Force, to back these groups to the hilt with weapons and uniforms and vehicles and supplies in that nature. So, we're told we shouldn't be worried about these groups, that the U.S. isn't supporting Shia, the extreme, quote-unquote, extremist militias. Meanwhile, groups like this that are responsible for the deaths of U.S. soldiers between 2003 and 2011. They're shouldering U.S. Won't either intentionally or unintentionally supplied M16s, and fighting as a legitimate agent of the Iraqi government against the Islamic State.
The chief exporter of terror in the Middle East is Iran. We see here that Iran has the ability to project power by pouring its men, its weapons, and its influence, even its orders, into Iraq, which used to be a client state of the United States. But now I turn to a matter that Tom Joscelyn has identified. This goes from the Iraqi theater to the Syria theater. Tom, a very good evening to you. Al-Nusra Front. Right now, they're operating to the east of Syria, where the Russians are making a big splash at Latakia. You have a report here of the Allies striking 2 Shiite towns in Idlib province. Last time I remember, we talked about Idlib province falling under the control of al-Nusra. So are these airstrikes against the Shiite favoring the al-Nusra Front? I need a scorecard here, Tom. Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. Well, yeah, the Nusra Front has attacked these 2 Shiite villages in the Idlib province. This is actually connected to the conflict down in southern Syria. Zabadani is the name of this small city with about 20,000 some odd residents, according to published accounts. And basically, in that city in southern Syria, there are a significant number of jihadists who are holed up, who are under siege by Bashar al-Assad's forces, Hezbollah, and their allies. And essentially what Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria, is doing is they're attacking these two Shiite villages in Idlib as sort of a counterweight to that offensive by the regime on Zabadani in the south. And this is a way for them to basically force a ceasefire to try and free their guys. And this has been going on for months, this back and forth. So those two conflicts are interlinked. And it goes to show, I think, just how strategic the whole thing is. That basically, this is really I compare it to, if you think about Game of Thrones and how complex that storyline is, the theater in Syria really is way more complicated even than that in terms of all the actors and who's doing what.
The al-Nusra Front, that's al-Qaeda in Syria. Are they demonstrating here war fighting we don't know about? They look like they're operating as a symmetrical warfare unit. Nothing raid about this. They look like they're moving on a wide front.
Yeah, I think Nusra Front, I was talking to some folks today about this actually in terms of trying to get a handle on how many fighters they have. And several people I talked to said that 20 to 25,000 fighters is not unrealistic at this point in terms of sort of their hardened cadres of guys who are fighting. And what they've done is very different from what the Islamic State does. What the Nusra Front does is they basically are very conservative in building up their manpower, and they're trying to indoctrinate and get guys to be basically their soldiers or fighters in the long run, as opposed to the Islamic State, which throws a lot of sort of human capital around, will just throw guys into the fight, basically achieve the objectives, and doesn't really concern itself with losing a significant number of guys at times. The Nusra Front is much more conservative in its war fighting, according to the people I was talking to, many of whom have actually been in Syria, actually. So it's an interesting dynamic between the two. The Nusra Front is definitely a sophisticated, strategic, military fighting force at this point. But then again, so is the Islamic State, and that's what makes it so complicated. Is you have multiple groups on sort of the anti-Assad side of the ledger, including other groups that are allied with al-Qaeda, groups that are fighting the Islamic State. You have the Kurds, of course, and then you have the international actors who are all trying to support the various proxies.
Al-Nusra Front operating in Idlib province, that's north of Latakia. Does this in any way threaten the Russian security zone or their resupply or their air corridors, anything like that, Tom?
Well, the interesting thing about Latakia is there's a long-standing, or a long stream of reports, I would say, of basically Chechen fighters being in Latakia and being involved in major battles there over the years, going back to at least 2013, if not beforehand. And to hear the Russians say it, they're trying to basically blame everybody in Latakia, all the jihadists in Latakia, as being the Islamic State. But there was a pretty good report, I thought, on Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe there, talking about how, in fact, these guys were really not Islamic State. In fact, if you look at their pedigree, they're all al-Qaeda. In fact, I'm going to follow a report on this very, very soon. The guys in Latakia who've been really posing a major threat that the Russians have been talking about are all allied with al-Qaeda and Nusra Front, not Islamic State. And yet the Russian rhetoric a lot of times makes it sound like they're fighting the Islamic State there, and it's actually not right.
So the Russians are going to go up against their Chechen adversaries right away. This is the Chechen war moved to eastern Syria.
Well, one of the things in western Syria, right? One of the things to keep your eye on.
Western Syria, yes. Thank you, Tom.
One of the big things to keep your eye on in Syria, in this part of on the coast there of the Mediterranean, is whether or not these Chechen brigades are still in Latakia, that province, it's a coastal province, the stronghold of the Assad family for really decades now. And going back through time, one of the guys who was actually leading one of these Chechen brigades in Latakia actually was trained by some of the Chechen leaders who were fighting the Russians in the Caucasus region, so in Chechnya, in Dagestan, in those areas, going back really to the early 1990s forward. So this is a guy who has a pedigree that really sort of goes all the way back to this conflict the Russians have been fighting in their own home turf.
Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, they keep the website, The Long War Journal. This is a vast conflict, many theaters. We've touched upon the Syrian conflict. We've touched upon the Iraqi conflict. When we come back with Bill Roggio, we'll go to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. I'm John Batchelor. I'm John Batchelor with my colleagues Tom Joscelyn and Bill Roggio of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. We started in Iraq, we moved to Syria, now back to Pakistan-Afghanistan border, the borderland that is crumbling for order, but is, we see right now, fertile ground for the Taliban in its iterations. We begin with the U.S. drone strikes, South Waziristan. This is a familiar area. We've been flying futilely over this area for quite some time, years now. Bill, 7 militants in drone strikes, South Waziristan. Do we have a scale from CENTCOM? What is the mission here? Are we killing the Al-Qaeda that is disorganized? Are we killing local leaders to favor Pakistan? Are we doing favors for the capital, Islamabad?
Yes, John. It's first of all, these strikes would be carried out by the CIA. How much planning is done with CENTCOM is probably minimal at best, in my opinion. The targets of these strikes are supposed to be, according to the Obama administration, Al-Qaeda leaders who pose an imminent threat to the United States.
The guys who are on their road to defeat, right?
Right, them, yes. This is why strikes occur there, frequent, or with relative frequency.
A lot of dead-end roads in South Waziristan.
Exactly. And what happens is they wind up killing a lot of local Taliban commanders or low-level fighters. They do kill Al-Qaeda operatives as well. What I suspect is that these are what they call the so-called signature strikes, where they detect some type of activity. It indicates that it may be a high-level or mid-level Al-Qaeda leader or commander, or from another jihadist group allied with the group. They launched a strike and hope and pray that they get who they thought they had.
Bill, we're conducting strikes like bold Indian fighters of about 150 years ago. These are just bounty hunters looking for scalps. There's no strategic value to killing people in South Waziristan in 2015.
I mean, look, the administration continues to tell us Al-Qaeda's on the run, and there's only, depending on what year it is, there's 1, there's 2, there's several leaders, there's 10 leaders, there's only 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. That numbers remain constant, and a couple hundred in Pakistan. So I don't think there's a strategy here. I think that what you have is we're plinking, as you mentioned. We kill some, and the optics are good. Hey, look, we killed a senior Al-Qaeda leader, and we could declare victory and go home. And the irony is this mode of fighting, this counterterrorism operations, has been carried over to Iraq and to Syria, and it doesn't work there. It hasn't worked in Pakistan. Sure, we've killed top Al-Qaeda leaders.
It does recruit for the bad guys, Bill, because let's go to the movement of the Taliban. You have a story up about the attack at Peshawar, the Air Force camp. That means striking at a Pakistan military base. And you have a photograph that is spectacular, the movement of the Taliban. All these men, these young men and these senior commanders, find it easy to recruit when the drones come and kill people, kill their family, their neighbors, the guys who live in the valley, and therefore the U.S. represents the villains they can recruit against.
Yeah, I think that certainly plays into a degree of the recruiting, but they had no problems recruiting prior to drone strikes. Yeah, I mean, my problem with the drone strikes is that we don't do them frequently enough. I don't think our intelligence is good as that people claim. And it's just enough to keep them off balance, but not enough to defeat the group. And the reality is these groups are dug in, and these are insurgency movements and not network terrorist groups. And then you have groups like the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan, which is launching full-scale assaults on Pakistani military bases.
Complicated assaults. Special suicide squad of 14 Fedayeen of the movement hit the Pakistani air base. What's this? A combo of shooters and IEDs. Who is Khalifa Umar Mansour?
He is the head of the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan in the Peshawar area. He is the same commander who directed the attack in December 2014 that killed well over 100 Pakistani high school. They were at a military high school. So, he is certainly a made man in the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. The fact that he's still operating almost a year after conducting that attack just shows how bad things are in Pakistan and how constrained the Pakistani military and intelligence services are in trying to go after guys like him, if they're even interested in going after guys like him.
Tom, you have a story up that is a puzzler, and you will interpret, please. Senior al-Qaeda leaders released, reportedly, from custody in Iran. The names here, Saif al-Adil, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, Abu Qahr al-Masri, Khalid al-Aruri, Sari Shihab. Why were they released, and are they a threat to the U.S.?
Okay, well, this is one of the murkier stories, I would say, in the post-9/11 world, because as the Obama administration has itself said on numerous occasions since July 2011, Iran allows certain al-Qaeda leaders to run a facilitation network on Iranian soil. They move fighters, cash, that sort of thing around the world to and from South Asia and, ironically enough, to and from Syria. But by the same token, there's been a select elite group or elite cadre of senior al-Qaeda leaders who've been held under some form of detention in Iran. And it's really not clear at any given time, how much they're really detained or how much contact they have with the outside world or what they're actually doing. The highest profile of these guys is known as Saif al-Adil, who has been wanted for his role in 1998 embassy bombings for a long time by the U.S. government. And his colleague there, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, one of the other guys you listed, has also been wanted for his role in the U.S. embassy bombings. These guys are very, very big and important in the al-Qaeda world. And so their release is important because basically this means that al-Qaeda is getting some of that sort of legacy leadership back in the fold, guys who are going to, rejuvenate some of their efforts in different ways. And I think one of the ways they're going to do that, now this is somewhat speculative, we don't know this for sure, but you mentioned another guy named Khalid al-Aruri. He was actually the right-hand man to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the first head of al-Qaeda in Iraq. He was a long-time companion of Zarqawi. And I think Saif al-Adil, a guy we mentioned, worked with Zarqawi very closely. I think what you could see, and this is what's being rumored now in jihadi circles, and this is somewhat speculative, is that al-Qaeda could be preparing actually to relaunch al-Qaeda in the Mesopotamia, which is a new branch of al-Qaeda, to basically compete with ISIS in Iraq as a jihadist group. And in fact, there are press reports in the last few days saying that al-Qaeda in the Mesopotamia flyers and pamphlets have been circulating around several cities in Iraq, basically saying, we're back and we're the real jihadist alternative to ISIS. They've deviated from the right way to wage jihad. We're going to show you the right way to do it, and we're going to compete with ISIS here in Iraq. These leaders are important for that effort, potentially, because they can claim that they represent Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's legacy. They can say that we're the real heirs of Zarqawi. We're the ones who worked with him. We really represent what he was doing here in Iraq, not ISIS. ISIS, of course, has tried to routinely claim that they are, in fact, the heirs of Zarqawi because they grew out of al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic State of Iraq, which was the first political front founded by al-Qaeda in Iraq. So this goes to a lot of the sort of intra-jihadi competition between al-Qaeda and ISIS in terms of the potential for what could unfold here.
Tom Joscelyn, Bill Roggio, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Tom reporting on Iran, our peace partner, releasing the dogs of war. I'm John Batchelor.